Welcome in, everyone. For those who do not know, my name is Guest, also known as ItsGuestGaming, and we are live here on Twitch for all of the reasons. Recording today's video about the new Series 5 card coming to Marvel Snap, Pixie. So, look, I'll be completely honest with you and say that Pixie was, out of all of the months that I've been doing this, and sitting here, whether it was for articles, for my own concepts, for videos, whatever it is, Pixie is, without a question of a doubt, the hardest card I have ever needed to theory craft with before. And that's not even exaggerating at all. I am legitimately struggling with this card. That's how insane it is. Because there's so many things that could go wrong with it, yet at the same time, because it is such a wild effect, it could be completely meta breaking. So let me make this very clear when it comes to Pixie right off the bat. If you're watching this video within the first 3 days of Pixie's release, I'm going to tell you already, don't get Pixie. Wait. We're going to need a lot of time with this card. I would literally wait until Monday of release week to decide if you want to get the card. Let us who are able right now to test a whole bunch of random things, let us tweak around with Pixie. Because you're going to see some decks right here that make no sense. And some of them are for fun, I'm not going to lie. But some of the things about Pixie are very particular to her that we need to discuss. So let's go into it. Let's take a look at Pixie, who is a 2/1. On reveal, shuffle the costs of all cards in your deck that started there. So there's a couple of things here. Number one, it's shuffle, which means take out, reorder, and place back in. So imagine you have a deck of cards and your top card is the Ace of Spades. You could shuffle that deck over and over and over and over and over again, and there's a chance that that top card is still an ace. It might be a different ace, but it's an ace, right? So a 6-cost card could trade places in cost with another 6-cost card. But at the same time, you could also do it with a 0-cost card, depending on how you build your deck. So based on whatever's left in there, I'm going to be very honest and say, if you do not have untapped.gg, Pixie is a detriment to you. But if you are playing on PC and you have the Untapped tracker on your computer, Pixie makes it a lot easier. It's a lot easier to play Pixie because you're able to see what cards are in your deck. You can see what costs are shuffling with what, because it is so much more difficult to do it in your head. Let's be completely honest. It's so much more difficult to do. So if you have Untapped, you're gonna like this card more than those who are playing on mobile. I'm sorry to tell you the truth there on that. But take that and run with it. Think of how Mr. Negative and the Peak and all of these other cards work when it comes to messing around with costs. If you have a negative deck and you play Zabu, right? That card that shifted out is still going to receive a reduction. For example, Shuri. If you have Shuri in a negative deck that has Zabu in it, Shuri turns into a 1/4 via negative, but then also still receives a Zabu discount and becomes a 0/4 because the base cost is 4 originally. Therefore, it will receive the reduction further. So you have to be weary of that part, number one. Number two, Pixie with negative, we now have it confirmed by the devs. It's not going to do what you think it'll do. It's actually going to be counterintuitive to play those two together because it's cost override over cost override. You're switching them, yes, but it doesn't make them permanent. It will just rewrite based on the base power. So you might have negatived that Shuri to a 1/4, but if you Pixie afterwards, say it switched with another 6-cost card that happened to be in your deck, like Arnim Zola. The base of Arnim Zola is a 6, which means that Shuri could potentially turn into a 6/4, not a 0/4 because of the power also switching. It's messing with base costs. So the reductions will come off of base costs like it still will with Mr. Negative, and it makes Pixie's viability in most decks very concerning. Because the very concerning factor about her, to me, is that how you build your deck with Pixie, who is going to be, she's going to be her own archetype. Pixie decks are going to be decks you have to build knowing that Pixie is going to be played. This is not going to be a plug-and-play card. You have to build it a very specific way. And there's 2 ways that kind of jumped into my head first and foremost. Number one, focus your entire deck around 3-cost, 4-cost, and Zabu. because then there's no harm, no foul. If a 4-cost switches to a 3, well then that's great, because then it can be Zabu'd even lower down to a 2. And then if a 3 becomes a 4, it's not the end of the world most likely, because a 4-cost card that was 3-cost, you could probably dance around that. It won't then get Zabu'd, but you could probably dance around it because of how cheap those 4 costs were due to Zabu. But the more I sat and thought on that idea, that interferes with your play line for Pixie, which is you want to play her on turn 2. That's the whole point of Pixie, is you really want that turn 2 possibility. But if you don't have it, then you need to have a backup plan. So you can't put together a whole deck of zeros like Wasp and Yellow Jacket and plop in your 6 costs and hope that they exchange based on whatever cards are in your hand. You've got to factor in a little bit of mitigation of damage and a little bit of mitigation of power simultaneously, whether you do or don't pull her. So let me show you a couple of the decks that I think are going to work very well with Pixie. One of them's for fun. I'll tell you confidently, because you're going to look at me like I'm an absolute idiot. But Pixie is going to be a fun card first and foremost. She will be a broken card second. Because if someone figures out, it could be one of these decks. If someone figures out how to take Pixie and break her, she might become the most valuable snap card in recent. I had to make a Cerebro deck just as a meme. I think this is going to be interesting, because this is funny to me. This is funny to me. I made a Cerebro 1 just to say that I did. There's no reason for it. There's no rhyme or reason. I literally just threw it together. You've got your Jubilee, you've got your Goblins, you've got your Iron Man and Professor X, because Cerebro can play on down here. I think that that would just be stupid fun. And then take advantage of a couple of the stones at the same time. Sure, why not? I just wanted to make it just to say that I made it, because it's Pixie, which could be cheap to have a 0-1 Professor X. Just saying. Anywho, so let's go to some real stuff now. Let's go into a Surfer deck that does make sense for her. I'm playing the brand new version of America Chavez, specifically. With the brand new version of America Chavez, I like the idea of boosting, specifically, random cards here, okay? Because now we're adding in another 1-cost card, and Pixie is playing the role of the only 2-cost card in here. What we're actually doing is rolling for our Absorbing Man and Sarah. We're aiming for 2 cards in this style of deck in particular, and that's it. We want the Nova, if it doesn't get pulled, or the America Chavez, if it doesn't get pulled, to be cards that we high roll for, to say, here, I'm going to switch those 1 costs with something. Because if you don't draw them, one of the worst parts about this specific type of card, Pixie, this specific type of deck, is that if you don't have your 1 costs or your 2 costs on a Surfer deck, you're playing nothing for 2 turns. But if you can catch up, because Pixie then said, hey, look, you're not going to draw them later. We're going to swap around the costs. And now, hey, look, you swapped your Nova with Sarah. I'm listening. Now I'm listening, because now you can play down a 1-4 Sarah and catch up a little bit on turns 5 and 6. So I like how Pixie presents a potential option to ramp out other cards if you don't pull them as a catch-up mechanic for specifically Surfer decks. So we're going to try her in a Surfer deck. There's some great 2-cost card options for Surfer, Goose being one of them. But I think if we limit the amount of targets when it comes to Pixie and high roll for just 1 or 2 of them to be drawn like that, that's going to be a nice balance there. That's going to be a nice balance. Here's the Fairy Hammers. So Pixie playing into 2 potential options here on a Thor, Beta Ray Bill, Jane Foster deck, right? Which is already a very strong deck. And I've talked about this on the podcast in the past previously, where I truly believe that Thor and Jane Foster should have to choose one of 2 choices on the 4-cost option. It's either you play Lockjaw or you play Beta Ray Bill. You can't play both. The reason I have both in here, though, is because with all of those hammers that could potentially be brought in there, what happens when you don't pull Jane Foster on turn 5? That's when this deck feels absolutely awful. But if you have Pixie on hand, you can then take those hammers that you are not guaranteed to play and high roll those hammers to be more valuable on your draw, because you'll be able to mix it with cards like your She-Hulk or your Scar to then maybe pull those out as a 0-10 or a 0-11. So I'm trying to build in here backup plans in case if you don't pull your Jane Foster on 5, or if you don't pull your Beta Ray Bill on 4, because the way I look at this deck is your primary game plan line on this deck typically is Jane into Beta, is Thor into Beta into Jane. If you don't have that, it's Thor into Lockjaw into Jane. If you don't have that, it's Thor into Lockjaw into Pixie. If you don't have that, it's Thor. You get the idea. You want Thor on 3, right? If you don't pull Thor, you have the defensive play of Mobius. If you don't pull it, you can also put in magic to buy yourself time. I think that this deck creates a defensive secondary line using Pixie because you're going to have upwards of 3 0-cost cards in your deck at the time of Pixieing, depending on how you draw. So Pixie is in here not to be a primary risk. She's there as a second plan in case if you don't pull the line that you originally were gunning for. And Miss Marvel in here in particular, as a Zabu option, I think should be a lot of fun. So fingers crossed with the Wasp here reducing down the She-Hulk or the Scar. So let's see what happens here. Next up, Big Dumb Pixie. Big Dumb Pixie. Look, Big Dumb Idiots is already a very successful deck, right? So what if we had the option to switch around some of those big dumb cards with others? Yes. Let's take a look at that. The just in case aspect. So you've got a couple of 2-card combos built in here. You have your armor into a Tuma. You have your sentry into a Nihilus. You have with Hood as a potential package play too. You have your defensive play with Cosmo. So what does Pixie actually bring to the table? Pixie brings to you a turn 5, again, specifically play, a turn 5 specific play that you've got your first combo. If that first combo comes on down, then you can go ahead and Pixie on 5 to buy yourself time. And then maybe cheat out another card on turn 6. Look, Pixie is a very risky card. So we have to play knowing that she's going to be a risky card. So sometimes the game plan, like the last deck, has to be a turn 5 only. So this is how I'm looking at her too. I'm only looking at her as a turn 5 because chances are, if I draw heavy, let's say, right? Because there are those games, you know them. There are those games where you draw all of your big cards and there's nothing you can draw, nothing you can play for a couple of turns. If you're stuck with your cheap cards in your deck and maybe one big card, there we go. There we go. We're going to switch that up and take advantage of Pixie to help us catch up on the later turns. I like that for Big Dumb Pixie in particular because it's already a successful deck that gives us a high roll on turn 5 to feed into it. Next up, Tinkerbells Cage. Tinkerbells Cage is playing into the idea that I'm gonna really hone down how many targets Pixie is going to hurt and how many targets Pixie is going to help. So Professor X only has positive gain pretty much in this deck, minus She-Hulk. And She-Hulk already takes advantage of Energy Cheat. So if she ends up with a base of 4 and then reduces further from that, that's great. So those 2 costs are what you're trying to sacrifice and dance around. I put Zabu even into this list exclusively for Iron Lad because you're looking to play Pixie on 2 in this deck and then lock things down from there as early as possible. So that's how I want to play into this deck, is I want to lock down with Storm on 3 with the shuffling pieces that could happen afterwards with Pixie either on 2 or on turn 4. You're able to see what you're shuffling up and what you're drawing most in particular, because Howard the Duck allows you to know which card you're drawing, but when you have the snap, the moment of Pixie, it doesn't shuffle the placements of the cards. It only shuffles the actual cards themselves and their costs. So you're still, let's say you see that you're drawing Professor X next turn. You're going to still draw Professor X, but now with a shuffled cost. So that is what is really intriguing to me about this deck in particular, because I think that she's going to be able to give us a nice little lockout play for Tinkerbell's Cage. And lastly, what I think will probably end up being some variation of her best potential home. Her best potential home is probably going to be High Evolutionary. I hate to say it, and I'm sorry. Look, you're going to play Infinite decks tremendously with her. And especially once Warhammer comes, yes, you're going to be playing a bunch of Evo, Infinite type of decks. But Pixie allows us to then say, look, that A-Bomb, that She-Hulk, that Hulk in this variation, yeah, it could be a 1. It could potentially be a 1 because if you have either of those 3, you have a 75% chance to draw one of your 3 1-drops on turn 1 when you're playing this. Go ahead and play it on down. I said Warhammer, everybody, War Machine. You know what I meant. Thank you, chat, for correcting me. This is why we do things live, and this is why editing isn't going to happen. So we continue on. You have a 75% chance of drawing your Sunspot Nebula or Misty Knight. With that then further said, if you didn't draw it, let's take advantage of it and Pixie it. So we've got 2 different shells here that work for the Evo. We went with the Toxic shell. So you have your Scorpion into your Psylocke, into your Spider-Woman, and your Abomination. You have that negativity, toxicity style of shell. Then on top of it, we have the Energy Cheat shell by Misty Knight, Shocker, technically Cyclops again as well, She-Hulk built into here too. So now we've got cheat on cheat on cheat on cheat, where we could ramp out if all goes well or poorly, depending on how you're looking at it. You have the chance at actually playing out Hulk, A-Bomb, Spider-Woman, and She-Hulk all on the final turn. It does add up with a Pixie in this type of deck. So I thought Evo made a lot of sense. I want to take a spin on it versus where a lot of people are going to be playing her and War Machine. Thank you, chat. We have fun here. Y'all should come down and hang out with us because we try a whole bunch of decks, because they've even corrected me as I said mixed messages on the last one, because I know it's going to happen in the YouTube decks comments section. Wasp is the only swap in, not the other hammers. Look, we're going to do all the fun stuff here. We're going to talk about how Pixie is going to be a game-breaking card, in my opinion, because she's either going to break the game or she's going to break your resources, because she's a Series 5 card. She's expensive and is coming out on the same week as Hope Summers. So hopefully you're using your resources accordingly. Wait until Monday to get Pixie. Let us peek around with her, see what decks work, what decks don't. I'll be honest and say I have more of a optimism for other cards this month than I do Pixie. But Pixie also has the highest ceiling to be an absolutely busted card in Marvel Snap. So stick around, everybody. We've got a lot of things to take a look at, but if you want a more consistent deck, I'll say confidently, it's probably going to end up being Hope Summers. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you all joining us here. If you want to come hang out with us during our lives, we are here on Twitch at ItsGuestGaming. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.